The DLC is coming out this week. I've got my Mesmer cosplay ready, and I can't wait to lick Miquela's hand and get transported into the lands between. Before we dive in though, there are some things that you should do first. Buffs, items, and more that you absolutely need to take with you to the DLC. Let's go! Let me know everything in the comments that I have missed. Also, I have a video already out that covers exactly how to unlock the DLC and like how to farm bell bearings and a bunch of other major items. If you want to go watch that next, I will link that here for you. So we'll start with some buffs and understanding the different types of buffs, because this is something that's a little confusing, but it's also very important for difficult boss fights in Elden Ring, and we're definitely going to get a lot of difficult boss fights in the DLC. Now, other than the permanent buffs that you can get from, say, your equipment, your talismans, spells, that sort of a thing, right? There are other temporary buffs that can significantly help you in tough boss fights, and for the most part, they fall into three major categories, though there are like some smaller categories of things like, say, you know, shield buffs or unique buffs and stuff like that. But there's really three main ones that you need to think about for any builds. The first is weapon buffs. Now, these will improve your offensive capability of your weapon specifically, typically like, you know, adding attack power, or more commonly status build-up effects, like, say, for example, grease effects, like adding the different greases that you can apply to your weapon to, say, add fire or scarlet rot or lightning, what have you. There are also the armament spells and incantations, which are essentially the same thing, except you're using a catalyst to cast them as spells or incantations to add those effects into your weapon. And then you've got Ash of Wars that do similar things. Think something like Cragblade that will add effects to the weapon, or Flaming Strike, which that second attack on Flaming Strike adds fire to the weapon, or Seppuku to add blood loss. And then other than that, you've got the unique weapon skills, like, say, the Moonlight Greatsword that adds unique effects to the R2 after you have cast it. But essentially here, these fit into one category, and you should be considering which one you want to use for different builds. Say, for example, if you're using my Cragblade Brawler build, which I put out the other day, which you should go and watch if you want a strength build, that's really good, then you'll definitely be using the Ash of War Cragblade to fit in this category. Body buffs are the next category, and these are personal buffs that boost any like stat that you want it to, right? But they are only personal to yourself, which is a key distinction to the next one. Flame Grant Me Strength is the most obvious one here, that increases your physical attack power and your fire attack power. Obviously fantastic for fire builds and physical builds in general as well. There are also the barrier incantations that you can cast on yourself to improve your negation to a specific damage type. The more common one that most builds will probably use, unless you are leaning into faith, is the boiled seafood and the cured meat. Now, the boiled seafood comes in two categories, being prawn and crab, but they both come from Bogart. You'll need to talk to him and complete a little bit of his quest line, either in the Learning of the Lakes or when he then moves to Lendal Capital, where you'll be able to buy the crab. Both of these will improve your damage negation when you do consume one of these. And the cured meats will improve any sort of resistance depending on what that is, right? Like, it depends on which cured meat you consume, or you could just consume the exalted flesh to improve your physical attack damage for 30 seconds, which you can actually craft as well as an alternative to, say, Flame Grant Me Strength. The last category here is the aura buffs. Now, these are buffs that buff yourself and anyone in your party, like your allies, that sort of thing, right? Typically, there's like one major one that this like is going to be using in most builds, and that is Golden Vow. Now, this can be cast as an incantation or as an Ash of War. Now, obviously, if you've got a faith build, you'll be using the incantation version, right? But for the most part, most people will be using this, and do use this, on a dagger because they're super light, putting the Ash of War Golden Vow on it, switch to the dagger at the start of the fight, cast Golden Vow, then you've got that buff for like 60 seconds, and then, you know, you can switch back to your normal weapon and set up, and you just get that buff to your attack power and your damage negation. Now, there are other weapons that do like similar, like aura buffs, like the Rallying Standard and that sort of thing, but for the most part here, the main one you need to think about is Golden Vow, right? By the way, if you want to know where you can get a lot of these Ash of Wars, Flame Grant Me Strength, Golden Vow, etc., I'll link those videos here for you that I have put together that you can go go and find the actual locations and learn a bit more about them. There are some other buffs that you could consider as well, like the Flask of Wondrous Physique to mix with your tiers that benefit your build. Maybe you want some extra HP regen like Bestial Vitality. There are other buffs that you should focus on, but those three, the weapon buff, the body buff, and the aura buff, are the main three that you should think about before you go into any of those boss fights. And what actually works for your specific build is like specific to whatever your actual build is, right? Like you can look at any of my build videos and I talk about them there, or if you've got your own build, you know, you've got those sort of different options. But for the most part here, you've either got a incantation version or like say an item consumable that can give you a similar buff that we've covered already. The next is the Great Runes. Now this is a mechanic that I've basically avoided, not necessarily on purpose, but I'm also not ashamed to admit that I didn't know that this existed for like most of my first playthrough. But essentially you will be collecting rune arcs throughout the game, and fun fact, if you use these when you have applied a Great Rune to yourself, you will get various buffs on top of the buffs that we have already talked about. Now these are quite incredible, and in order to get them you will need to defeat the demigods to collect their Great Runes and then go to their respective divine tower to activate said Great Rune. There is really two that I think are like the most important. It is up to you, right? Like obviously build specific things, but for the most part there's two that you really need. The first being Godric's Great Rune, which is the very first Great Rune that most people get, and then in the Limgrave Divine Tower you can activate it. And the second is Radahn's Great Rune in Caelid, obviously by beating Radahn, which you'll need to do for the DLC anyway, and then the Divine Tower there. Now Godric's Great Rune increases your all attributes by 5, which is just a great buff across the board, especially for early in the game. And Radahn's Great Rune increases your maximum HP, FP, and stamina. The other part that you will need here are those rune arcs. Now you will find them like all throughout the lands between, just like everywhere, but they are kind of tricky to farm. Giant rats do have a small drop chance of actually dropping them, but the best way to get a few of them is typically from nomadic merchants, as a lot of those merchants in the game will actually sell you about like groups of 3, and you can buy 5 actually at the Twin Maiden Husks as well. But having a large stock of these can definitely help you get into the DLC as well, right, and fight some of those tougher bosses with all of the buffs we've talked about, plus then adding your Great Rune buff on top of that. You've got a lot of benefit there. Focus is a stat that you need to think about pretty critically when it comes to the DLC. Now, we all know that Miyazaki loves his swamps, and if I was a betting man, I would be saying that we're going to get some sort of sleep swamp in the DLC, not only because it does appear like that in the trailer, but also because there is a lot of themes around sleep and Saint Trina with Mikola. So I think that there's definitely a high chance that there will be a lot of sleep in the DLC. So I just wanted to cover the focus stat for you guys here. Now, focus is a stat in Elden Ring that the higher your focus, the lower the speed of your sleep buildup is, because you have a higher resistance to sleep. Now, all armor pieces have a focus value, right? Obviously, higher the better if you're focusing on focus, and you can increase your focus in other ways, like the clarifying horn charm, which I covered how to get in my recent best talismans video. I'll link that here for you. Or you can remove your buildup entirely with the stimulating boluses, which I definitely think we should be all taking a few of these into the DLC. Now, if you do get one of the Nomadic Warriors Cookbook 16, you can just like craft these yourself. However, the simplest way is by going and defeating the bell-bearing hunter at the Hermit Merchant's shack in Atlas Plateau. In order to do this, you will need to be there at night and then rest at the Site of Grace. The merchant here will disappear and the bell-bearing hunter will appear instead. Upon defeating him, you take that bell-bearing back to the Twin Maiden Husks, and you'll just be able to buy an unlimited amount of stimulating boluses from the Twin Maiden Husks at the Round Table Hold, and then you can use these in the DLC when they do become relevant, because I personally think they will. I could be wrong, but we'll see. And the last major stat that you guys should focus on is your item discovery. Now, if you are anything like me and you love theory crafting and finding new weapons and armor and like cool stuff, item discovery is definitely going to be an important stat to think about for the DLC. Now, if it's anything like the main game, you will come across enemies that have unique armor and weapons, and they have a very tiny percentage chance of actually dropping that gear. The more item discovery stat you actually have, the higher that percentage chance is. Now, the first way to increase your item discovery is via your arcane stat. Every point in arcane will gain you 1 item discovery stat. Now, this is also relevant for any like equipment, like talismans, that sort of thing that increase your arcane as well. You'll get that transfer to item discovery as well. There is also the silver pickled fowl foot, which will increase your item discovery by 50 for 3 minutes. This is also a craftable. And the second is the silver scarab, which is a talisman that increases your item discovery by 75. Now, this is found in the hidden path of the Erdtree. I did cover this in that talisman video I mentioned earlier as well. But with all of this, and if you are running an arcane build as well, you'll have a significantly higher item discovery and have a higher chance of all those items dropping. I'm probably going to be taking a arcane build to my first playthrough through the DLC for that reason. So I have a higher chance of this stuff dropping, because you never know what enemies are actually carrying when we're fighting new enemies again, because it'll probably take a while to figure this out, because typically they have a very low drop rate. So the higher your arcane stat, the higher chance of actually these things dropping, which is always fun to see. But that is everything I have for you guys today. Let me know if you're excited for the DLC and anything I have missed in this video. But thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.